See the reason we're here, Katie Flynn tonight. We can give her a big round of applause. We celebrate Island Rule. And her conversation partner tonight is Lewis Buzbee. But before I go into introducing both of them, I have some business to take care of. So one, I want to thank you all for coming here in person, as well as our folks online. And I want to add on that we are broadcasting from San Francisco, which is unceded Ohlone Ramaytush land, and I hope you join us in Green Apple's pledge to turn land acknowledgement into action and donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization every time you hear land acknowledgement. We actually have a great QR code at the back desk, which is actually right next to you for some of you in the crowd, and you can use that and check it out to learn more. Some brief business. So if you haven't, please silence your phone now. But note that even though you're silencing your phone, picture taking is encouraged. Please share these images on social media as much as you like. And also check out our events calendar online. We have some more events this week and coming up next week that are going to be really awesome. The restroom is behind this curtain, but as you can see, it's not going to be able to be used during the event for obvious reasons. And we will have copies of Katie's book, Island Rule, as well as the companions up front for purchase, as well as Lewis's books, The Yellow Lighted Bookshop, and the other one from Grey Wolf that is escaping my name. I'm so sorry. That's one. It's great. It's going to be there. And so a special note is that when you buy books from us, you are not just supporting independent bookstores, but also supporting writers who put so much work into the books like these two. And you also get to have a book. So, Lewis Buzbee is the author of The Yellow Lighted Bookshop and the award-winning novels for younger readers, Steinbeck's Ghost, The Haunting of Charles Dickens, and Bridge of Time, along with several others. His poem, essays, and stories have appeared in Lit Hub, Harper's, GQ, New York Times Book Review, Paris Review, Zizva, and elsewhere. A new novel, Diver, will come out next spring. And Katie Flynn is a writer, editor, and educator based in San Francisco. Her short fiction has appeared in Colorado Review, Indiana Review, The Masters Review, and Tin House, among others. She has been awarded Colorado Review's Nelligan Prize for short fiction, a fellowship from the San Francisco Writers Grotto, and the Steinbeck Fellowship in Creative Writing. She holds an MFA from the University of San Francisco and an MA in Geography from UCLA. She is the author of The Companions and this current collection of short stories that we are going to be hearing from tonight. And you can find her on social media like Twitter, as well as her website, burythebird.com. And without further ado, let's have a big round of applause for them as I go away and they take the turn.
Can y'all hear me back there? Yeah, okay, great. I first met Katie over 20 years ago when she showed up in one of my classrooms at the University of San Francisco. It was great. And I knew you have some moments as a teacher when you read someone for the first time, you're like, oh, this is the real deal. Not only could she tell stories, and not only did she know how sentences work, but she had an incredibly unique outlook on life. Yeah, we'll go with unique. And I've stayed in touch with Katie ever since. I was here for the reading for the Companions launch, which happened like about 20 minutes before lockdown.
Yep.
And it was a novel that opened in a San Francisco that was beset by plague. So we're hoping there's not another plague coming.
Luckily, I didn't write about that this time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Rats.
So I was really looking forward to this book of stories, and then I was really disappointed to discover that it was not indeed a book of stories. It's something quite other than a book of stories. We expect sort of obsession in a collection of short stories, the same characters, the same plots, the same world, and that's part of their joy. And there is all of that in these stories in this collection, but it is hooked together so intensely and so differently than any other collection that I've read. It really is its own form, It's more like a sphere than a collection of short stories. And Katie hooks all these little things throughout that bring it all together. It's not just the characters or the places, but it also includes tunnels. So you'll find all of these things floating around in different stories and not necessarily connected. So we've got a blue hair clip, islands, dictators, a 19th century explorer's teeth, mounds of bones, hamsters, and that's just the beginning. It's the most coherent world I've read in a long time. So, what's up with that? Tell us about these hooks, the coherence as a lead into.
Yeah. Well, as Lewis was saying, there are a number of objects that kind of carry their way through the collection. For example, there's a set of teeth that were removed from an explorer's mouth by his crew when they got caught in the Northwest Passage, and they were pretty mad at him. And somehow those teeth seem to sort of weave their way through the story. So they start out at first in the island dictator's hands, but then he has to sell them on eBay. And a day trader in Oslo, Norway decides to pick them up, and he sells them at a street market to a retired businessman from Eden Prairie, Minnesota. And then he wagers them in a game of pool against a survivalist from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. He wins that game, but the survivalist steals the teeth anyway. And then she ends up passing them down to her nephew. And in the last story of the collection, what you have is the nephew's girlfriend becomes somewhat obsessed with the teeth, and this explorer, whose name happens to be Goldenrod. So it sort of carries all the way through the collection and becomes this way of sort of connecting the pieces and connecting the lives of these characters. And that's just one of the ways the stories are connected. The overall shape is kind of spherical. The way that the story collection is organized is that the first story and the last story link up. So the first story is narrated by a mom, and the last story is narrated by that daughter. The second and the second to last story connect, the third and the third to last, until you meet in the middle. And then the two stories at the middle are literally like mirror reflections. They're two neighbors looking out at each other. And the middle stories are called Mankato, and then the other one's called Otoknum, which is reverse. So there's lots of fun ways in which these stories kind of collide into one world.
Well, speaking of these stories, would you read a little bit for us?
Yes, I would. I thought I would read a bit from the first story in the collection called Disaster Kids. So this one follows a woman who, as a teen, was living in Los Angeles and was in an all-girl punk band, and was used to being kind of on stage and in the limelight. Now she's in her 40s. She's a stay-at-home mom, and she lives in San Francisco, and she feels pretty invisible. Her daughter, 5-year-old Agatha, is struggling at school, and her husband, Daniel, is no help. So her rage is building, and as it builds, she transforms into a monster. So I'm going to read a section.
And she literally transforms.
Yeah, literally. Those mounds of bones Lewis was talking about, they're throughout the collection. She's the one leaving them behind. So I'm going to read a part from when that transformation has just begun. In the mirror the next morning, I see that my hair's gone completely white. It's not a big deal. I've been dyeing for years, but I've never heard of such a thing, hair dropping its color overnight. I look so old, and there's no time to do anything about it before the walk to school. So I'm hiding under the hood of my sweatshirt, Agatha freaking out, crying and storming ahead, shouting back at me, "I don't know you." I walk a few feet behind her all the way to school, trying not to let the other parents staring rattle me. Agatha sprints through the doors, not for her classroom so much as away from me, and I don't follow her inside, don't let myself linger on this acute pain. I want to escape, to vacate my body, which has come to feel like a prison, changing all around me, always changing when the world would prefer me frozen in time, in youth, an impossibility. But the mom I think is named Susan is in my path, smiling in that forceful way of hers. Did you change your hair? She asks. I cinched the hood of my sweatshirt smaller. It looks great, very bold. And that Agatha, she went right into school, barely any tears. You must be so proud. On the way home, I have murderous thoughts involving the mom I think is named Susan. I stop at Walgreens for a box of dye, then redo my hair in the bathtub. And when I pick Agatha up in the afternoon, I get another okay day from Miss Patty. Agatha walks ahead of me, arms crossed at her chest, grunting at me if I try to pace her. After she's asleep, I head down to the garage, amp up my guitar, but I can't make my way into anything that feels right. An old, familiar ugliness rises inside me, the counterpart to dissent, shame. My parents once told me I had to be suffering from mental illness to make ugly noise like that. We haven't spoken in years. They've never met their granddaughter. Surely I'm done with shame. I go directly to bed, ignoring my hunger, not for chocolate, putting a pillow to my head to silence the scratching sounds from outside. I'm not afraid, I tell myself. The world is full of scratching sounds. When I was a girl growing up in Orange County, we would get mice. My dad said it was normal. Our home abutted an empty field. For a time, cattle grazed there, then they didn't. In the summer, when it got too warm for the mice in the fields, they would invade our house. I'd find them under the bed, in my closet. Once I stepped into a shoe to discover a hot, living creature. I screamed, an absolute animal sound coming out of me, and my mom came running. When she found out it was just a mouse, she got angry. Get used to them, she shouted. But I never could. I wished for the mice to go away like the cows. I didn't really care what happened to them, only that they were gone. And now I understand that wishing invisibility on any creature is a type of murder. The next day, my hair is returned to white, my skin cracked and gray like parched mud. I'm staring into the mirror, staring and trying to understand. My God, my skin, could it really be gray? And the wrinkles, I am chronically dehydrated, but still, it's as if I've aged into an old woman overnight. Worse than that, a corpse. Agatha the Great loses it. She cries as she dresses herself and claims her lunch from the counter. I try not to freak out in front of her, telling her, Mommy's just got a rash, to eat her breakfast. She won't let me comfort her as she wolfs down her oatmeal, nearly choking she's eating so fast and crying. And when I try to follow her out the front door, she shouts, no, and raises a palm at me. What if you get lost? I call after her, but she's practically running down the street. Clutching hood up, I wrap the lower half of my face in a scarf and follow her at an unsafe distance. Watch from the footbridge as she stomps past Wayne, ignoring his enthusiastic, good morning. He glances around, as if for me, and I drag myself in the direction of home. My neighbor, the dog walker. I see her across the street with a pushcart of groceries, savoring that sighting of her widow's peak. Her hair a natural auburn with a rare gray, unlike mine that went gray far too young, which is white now, I remind myself. She waves. She calls my name. How does she know my name and I don't know hers? I tromp on, pretending I can't hear her. At home, I phone Daniel, tell him he has to come back immediately. He sounds sedated, like he's stoned or hungover. I have no idea what he gets up to in New York. He says he can't and makes me scream at him that this is very fucking serious. I'm sick, and if he doesn't come home, I don't know what. We have an unpleasant argument, and he hangs up on me, and I sit on the edge of my bed filled with so much anger and unknowing. The last time I spoke to my parents, Daniel and I had driven down to San Juan Capistrano for Swallows Day, a celebration of the birds' migratory return to the Mission Basilica. We'd watched a slow parade of marching bands and men dressed up like explorers on the backs of horses, had 2 beers at the local cowboy. We went back to my parents' place for dinner. My dad grilled the vegan sausages he picked up for us special. He kept calling them that, special, as if vegan sausages were some great delicacy. We were starving, Daniel and I, and totally devoured those sausages while my parents watched, smiling as if our eating pleased them. You like the sausages? My dad asked. Daniel and I nodded, our mouths too stuffed to speak. My mom had a good laugh at this. What's so funny? I asked her. Javelina, Dad said. Those hairy pigs from the desert? I stopped chewing. What's that? Those sausages are javelina. After some gagging, I told my dad words I'd practiced with Daniel in the shadows of similar instances. I'm an adult now, and if you can't respect my beliefs, well, we can't have a relationship. Beliefs, my dad scoffed. As far as he's concerned, there's only his opinion. Everything else is wrong, wrong, wrong. How do you work with that? How do you eat the javelina sausage? You don't, Daniel said, and of course, in this instance, he was right. You don't eat the javelina sausage. The swallows didn't come back to the mission that day. They haven't for years. Their migratory cycles shifted by urbanization and climate change and who knows what else. And I never returned either.
So I was struck by all of the connections and the way these stories overlap and cross over, and which feels so real. But I was also struck by this, and the question for you is how weird these stories are. And I'd love for, and they, because of those connections, they create this entire weird universe. I'd love for you to tell me what your world is.
Yeah, so I think the two things I was riffing on the most when I was writing this collection would be tech, living in the Bay Area. I think that comes into our lives. It comes into our lives anyway, but especially here. And then ecology and the environment, right? With my background in geography and biogeography specifically, those are two pretty prevalent themes. And when you put those two things together, you do get weird. Yeah.
Is it that the world is weird and writers just help us see it?
Yeah. The world is weird. I think in my fiction, I try to heighten things. So, for example, in the story I just read, Disaster Kids, mom's feeling enraged is not, a foreign concept. Mom rage is a book now. And there's a reason for that. So, taking it and heightening it, right? Turning a mom into an actual monster. I'm a little bit concerned about privatization of natural lands, for example. So I set one of my stories in a state park that has been privatized. And as a result, there's a prison now, and there's all sorts, there's drone delivery in the park, and it becomes this sort of creepy commercial setting for this story of grad students who work there trying to save the local pygmy rabbit that's going extinct, and they start disappearing in the setting. So, yeah, I think it's sort of this riff on heightening things that I'm concerned about in our world now and just taking them up a notch for fun.
So there are a lot of people who disappear in these stories, just walk away and are never seen again, and not under any mysterious circumstances necessarily. And then there are people who just appear in another person's life. What about all these disappearances?
Yeah. I don't know. I think anyone who has lived in San Francisco for any length of time has experienced a chronic disappearance of people. And people are always coming, But I think in this collection, I was interested in absence. And I think I play against that by the way that the stories connect. A person might feel absent, like the mother in this first story. She becomes a monster, she disappears. In the second story, you have her neighbor narrating, and her neighbor is sort of haunted by these posters that are on all of the lampposts everywhere of her missing neighbor. So I'm interested in absences, the shadow spaces that people leave behind in our lives.
Yeah.
And then the connections that we form with other people to fill those spaces, though the shadow always remains, right?
Yeah. I'm interested in, there are a number of different approaches to short stories in here, from structure to voice, etc. So I'm really interested in the narrative voices for pheromones and the tarot cards in there. I'd love to hear you talk about that story and how that works.
Sure. So Pheromones is a story about a mom who was living in San Francisco with her husband and her two sons when her husband is convicted of some white-collar crime and he goes down the coast to prison. And she's sort of shamed out of her own life, basically, and buys a house outside Sacramento, has her own hill, can't see her neighbors. She's homeschooling her kids. But to make it work, she has to take a tenant on. And her tenant is this woman, Candy, who's a healer and reads tarot. And the story opens with Candy reading this, giving a reading to the narrator, Dee. And the entire story is structured around that reading. So it's a 10-card reading, and it's broken up into 10 parts based off of that reading. But I think the interesting thing about the structure of that story is that it's like the worst tarot reading you could ever get, because instead of talking to Dee about her life and what's going on in it, Candy is just telling her own story through the reading. And I think that's another thing to think about with my collection. It's like stories within stories. And also too, I think process-wise, this is a story where I let go of control a little bit, and I actually gave my character a tarot reading. And the reading that I gave her is the reading that she gets in the book, the cards that she gets. And I let that kind of dictate the structure and direction of the piece, which was really nice, because I think as writers, it's like we're in a position to constantly control everything. I mean, that we're the world builder, right? So introducing a bit of chance into the collection, into the story in particular, was quite fun.
Yeah. And Back Out Baby, it's a I don't know if I love this story or not, or if I hate it. Well, I'll let you tell the story. You use a really interesting point of view structure. So every other section in the story is either the first one is third person, and then the first one is
Collective first.
Collective
We,
first,
yeah.
the we, and then it switches to the I, and then it switches back to the we. And I'd love to hear you talk about that strategy.
Yeah, so Back Out Baby is about a married couple from LA. One of them, the wife, is she's an agent. She reps Hollywood writers. And then the husband does landscape architecture. And they've been working really, they've been working at getting a child through adoption for many years. They get really close. They've done IVF. They've done all the things. They get really close. And then at the last minute, the birth mother decides not to go through with it. And so they're in this point of devastation, really, but they're trying not to feel devastated. So what they're doing with their time is they're going on vacations. Like, they just go away every weekend. They go on a driving trip. And in this case, they go to San Luis Obispo. And the first section is narrated by Evan and the husband. And Evan is a bit codependent. He literally cannot talk about them or himself without saying we, whereas his wife, she still has a strong sense of the I, and she's at that point where she's somewhat infuriated and feels a bit claustrophobic in her marriage as a result. So that sort of plays out in San Luis Obispo, and things get a little dark.
And I'd love you to talk about, I'm trying to give you some sense of the variety of the stories, so I'd love to hear you talk about King of South Phoenix, which is pretty much science fiction.
Yeah, so the stories, they travel around in time quite a bit. Some of them go back to the near past, I would say. Like, I have a story that's set, that opens during Y2K. And then in this story, we're in a sort of near future scenario. It's set in South Phoenix, and it follows Joel, who is a failed TV writer And he's basically signed up to do a reality TV show called The People's Choice. And what he does is he represents a region that's been pretty much destroyed by the climate crisis. And so he's the king of South Phoenix. He represents South Phoenix. He's in a glass tower above the ruin that is South Phoenix in this future state. And he has to periodically make cases to the viewers to like, please pick South Phoenix for revitalization funds over like Greater Dearborn or some other wrecked and disenfranchised place. And he's alone up there with a talking crow. Well, a crow that he taught to talk.
There are a lot of birds in this.
Yeah.
In these stories. Yeah. I'd love to hear you talk about how you came to the understanding that you could hook these stories together and what that process was like through the writing of it.
Yeah, I think that's why Disaster Kids comes first in the story, or in the collection, because I really wanted to do more with that monster mom. I knew I didn't want to write a whole novel about it. I had all these other stories I was interested in, but I liked her presence and what she represented. And so throughout the collection, you'll find that characters will be talking about the bone mounds in the news, or we saw that, I saw one on social media in Hollywood. Everyone was taking photos with it. It sort of becomes this strange part of the landscape, that people just live with. And I was also kind of writing into, my own fears about things that we just sort of accept, or we don't accept, but we have to live with it. Thinking about like what it was like during lockdown, like accepting COVID as a part of our existence, school shootings and gun violence, things like that, that we just have to live through and live with. And so for me, the bone mounds became that thing, right? That everyone just has to we have to keep existing, even though there's some terrible killer out there leaving them all over the place.
Yeah. I've talked about this as a collection of stories that's so coherent and so mashed together. It's almost like a novel, but again, I think it's really something separate, something brand new. But I'd love to hear you talk about, as someone who's written a novel and has written a lot of short stories, because that's what you were writing when I was working with you. And I'd love to, and we don't read short stories as much as we should as a culture. It's always novels, really, that take over. I'd love to hear you talk about the short story, what it can do, why we should be reading it.
Yeah, I love short stories, both reading them and writing them. They take a lot longer, by word count, to write stories because you pack so much into them. Right now with my students in my historical fiction class, we're reading Joan Silver's Ideas of Heaven. Has anyone read that one? It's really lovely. It's called A Ring of Stories, and so it's a collection of interconnected stories. But what I love about it so much is how she is able to tell a whole life in a story, a whole life story. She has one story called Gaspara Stampa that is about a 16th century poet, and you get like her whole life story in just 30 pages. There's this compression at work. I also think short stories allow you to play with ambiguity more, like where the story lands, whereas with a novel, we want a little more of a sense of resolution or direction at the end. With a story, we're allowed to play with ambiguity. And I don't know, life is full of ambiguity and not a lot of resolution. So for me, sometimes short stories feel a little bit closer to experience. Whereas novels, I think, they have to find an ending that provides satisfaction, right? And also too, with stories, I don't know, I have all these weird ideas and I don't always want to write 300 pages about each one of them. I want to get to the next one. Hamsters. Yeah, I have a lot of hamster stories.
There's a lot of hamsters. Yeah. There's one hamster that reoccurs twice. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, occurs twice.
Yes.
That's wonderful about ambiguity in short stories, and in this, to me, it feels like we're living in a fractured world these days. In part because of social media and everything is broken up. Do you feel like the short story might be more amenable to or more revealing to this age than in previous times?
Yeah, novels are getting shorter, right? So I think the short story form offers something for readers that maybe we're ready for right now, but a little bit more bite-sized read. But I also think that, you know, the sense of ambiguity or uncertainty is something that like a story can really capture that is, I think, at least since lockdown anyway, has felt like a really pretty profound presence in life. People are facing it for the first time in my life anyway, in a real direct way, and it's scary. And the story, I think the story form is great for that, you know, pushing people into uncertainty and not giving them, you know, really clear-cut answers.
And there's so much money in short stories.
Oh yeah, that's definitely the reason to do it. All the money.
Well, this question, who was your favorite teacher at USC? You don't have to
I've got Nina in the audience too.
This is my real big question. It's called Island Rule, and islands and the notion of island rule sort of permeate. They're one of the great hooks that goes through. Could you talk to us about island rule and that theory and how it fits in here and why you're using it?
So island rule is an ecological theory that basically premises that on islands, small omnivorous species tend to get bigger while large carnivores tend to get smaller. So you could say in general terms that predators get smaller and prey get bigger. So it's sort of a beautiful power reversal that I really love. And on one island, for example, there is an accelerated evolution in the title story. But I also think it applies to a lot of the situations. You have in these stories a lot of characters who are used to living life in a quiet way and suddenly they have to get loud. Or you have characters who are used to a lot of attention and suddenly they're alone. Characters who are used to succeeding and now they're failing and vice versa. So it's sort of this reversal. And I think it works with the structure too, this idea of sort of mirror reflections of one another. There's one story called The 13 Films of Victoria Umla, which is basically about a retired businessman. He gets the teeth there, and when they go on vacation to Oslo, he goes with his wife. But while they're there, everyone keeps calling his wife Victoria, and they keep saying like, "Wow, you look so much like her." And this Victoria is no longer around. She's died under mysterious circumstances. And yet the husband starts to wonder, well, wait a second, is my wife this Victoria? You know, she originally was from Oslo, and they never found the Victoria's body. So there's these interesting kind of play on mirror and identity and people reflecting, you know, back on one another.
Talk about the way time works in this collection of stories, because even though they're linked, there's some fluctuations in there.
Yeah, so the collection, this is one of the things I love about writing an interconnected collection of stories versus a novel, is I wasn't thinking super consciously about this being chronological or linear. I was thinking about the connections being more emotional and based on memory. And memory doesn't work in a linear fashion, right? We tend to loop back on things and circle. It's more circular. And so time moves in a more circular fashion in these stories. For example, there's one character, Joel, the TV writer, who shows up in The King of South Phoenix. Then you see him as a failed TV writer. Then you see him later as, you know, a young person, and he's just kind of coming up with his ideas, and he's a coward. He wants to be a writer, and then he ends up writing this show. You meet him later in LA, and he's writing this show, and it's this big success, and his show is called Island Rule. So you don't necessarily see the characters in a linear fashion. You might get them at different moments, but you know, the connections between the stories function, I think, like a little bit more in a circular fashion in that sense, and a little bit more like
that whole sphere thing again. There's no straight line going forward. What question have I not asked you?
Oh, well, we could talk about the universal algorithm, the epigraph at the beginning.
Please.
Yeah, so...
No, you.
Okay, I'll tell. So at the beginning of the book, there's an epigraph, and it's a piece of fiction. It says, "Inside the machine's mind, all our lives churn," and it's written by Jamie Lick, original designer of the universal algorithm. And so you have to wait till the last story before you get to understand what that means. But basically, Jamie Lick created, he has a big tech company, and the narrator of the final story, Us Being the Org, Being Us, works for him. And her job is to polish people. So she basically scrubs their reputation, tries to bring their rankings up in the system. But the universal algorithm is also the tool by which they are ranked. And it all works within the org. So the org ranks you, say you get a 4. Most everybody gets a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10. And then you can hire somebody at the org to then polish and bring your rank up. Right, so it's the sort of, and polishing is the service that's getting offered throughout the collection. Some people go for it, like that husband who went down the coast to go to prison. He has a polishing service, but other characters decline.
So now the question writers hate the most. How's your writing going? What you working on?
What am I working on? Well, I was trying to take a break from writing just to focus on releasing my book, but I'm not really taking a break. I have 2 novels that I have drafts of, one that I have feedback from my agents on now, so I'm working on revisions. And that one is basically about a tech worker who gets tapped to be the story architect of the memoir for the tech company's CEO. But as she's working with him, you guys, as she's working with him, they start to unravel a sort of mystery around the death of his father, who was the tech company's original founder and one of the original founders of the internet in my book. And then I'm working on, I have another full draft of a novel that I haven't gotten feedback on yet, but I have a draft. And that one is about a woman who flees San Francisco in a monstrous relationship with a man. She lands in Iceland, in Reykjavik, and only to find herself in another relationship with a man that turns monstrous. And her new friends there, develop a theory that she's the carrier of a transmissible darkness that she's passing to people. So.
Whatever. I just wish you were getting more work done.
Me too.
You have like jobs and gravity and food and stuff like that. Right? Yeah. I'd love to open it up to questions that you all might have. So who's got a question? Chris.
Charles.
Oh, yeah. So when you were talking about this mirror structure, it made me think of Cloud Atlas. And I was going to ask you, are there writers or inspirations that kind of led you to create this sort of structure and these strange things?
Yeah.
So Charles, for people in the back, Charles is asking about the mirror qualities here and any literary influences, other writers that Katie has.
I love that book. So I find it very inspiring. I also really love Jennifer Egan's A Visit from the Goon Squad, which one of the things I love about it is it's never really qualified whether it's a novel or a collection. It just doesn't say. And she never says either, which I love. Like why it lives in this sort of intermediate space, which is really interesting to me. And I think as a writer, I'm interested in border regions. I'm both as a geographer with a background studying border politics, but also as a writer. I like, for example, in my collection, the first story I read veers a bit into horror. 13 Films of Victoria Umlaw is a bit of noir. Mystery comes up in Copulation, the one in the park where the grad students are disappearing. There's near future climate fiction. I like to play with genre and I like to have fun with that. And I think there's playfulness in A Visit from the Goon Squad when it comes to genre there as well, which I find really pretty cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions? There was a hand back there. Sure.
Work in short stories and novels. Have you tried novellas? Is that something that interests you? Would it allow you to do something different in that type of work, or do you really prefer the others?
I think
So
so.
the question is about whether she's worked in the novella form.
Yeah, I think most of my novels start out as novellas. And a lot of my stories end up almost novella length. Interestingly enough, I like to write stories. I think my sweet spot is like the 7,000 word story, which is almost on the edge. Yeah, I mean, the novel that I'm working on right now is only 220 pages. It's a very lean novel, still considered a novel. So I think I'm always playing with pushing, but maybe I should just write a novella.
Just to show off. Yeah.
Lewis has written a novella.
Who else here? Other questions? Nyman.
None of your stories, I know you're truncating them or reducing them down, but they seem like high concept. I'm wondering when in the writing process do you sink down versus staying in the high concept idea of it versus plunging?
So the question is, a lot of the stories seem high concept, and when does Katie sort of dive down from that concept into creating the actual stories?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I'm very much a voice writer. And so until I know my character's voice, I kind of can't, even if I have the concept, I can't really write into it. And once I have the voice, I have the attitude, I have the relationship to the world. I think too, I like to do a lot of, with stories especially, I feel free to just write and get rid of a bunch of material. With a novel, I want everything I want to know what I'm doing because it's so much work. But with a story, I feel I can explore more, which is very freeing and helps me to get away from the concept. But also too, I like to give each of my characters, even if there is, like for example, in The King of South Phoenix, he's participating in this reality TV show, but he has his own personal dilemma that he's dealing with as well. And the story itself is all one-sided messages that he's sending to his ex-girlfriend. She never responds, but it's just like an endless array of messages that he sends her. It's the whole story. And he's, alone, and he wants his girlfriend back, and he's sad. And so adding this sort of personal problem within the higher concept of the story, I think, is how I ground it.
Do you start with ideas and concepts, or do they rise up out of the story as you're writing it?
I think I usually start with some sense of what it is I'm wanting to write about. I might have just the idea. I might think to myself, okay, I want to write. My parents used to live north of Phoenix, and when we would drive through there, it would be so hot, and yet there would be like water features everywhere, and it would be so green, and just like, this can't last. This makes no sense. And so, I think I see these things in the world that I want to talk about, and then I do the thing that I do, which is amplify it. And I get my concept, I think. Sometimes I feel like the concept and the character come together, like the concept couldn't have existed without his sort of sad sack nature. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Now, these are not quiet stories. This is not the slice of life. This is the slice of, yeah.
Do you have, I'm sorry, do you have any forthcoming short stories? Are you working on anything right now?
Does she have any new short stories coming out?
Not presently. I'm focusing on a couple of novel projects right now, but talking about this book and being in this world right now, because you write it. It takes a full year from the time you submit a polished draft to publication. So they already kind of feel somewhat like from the past by the time you're talking about them. But so talking about them now has made me think, man, I should write a short story, a new one.
Yes.
So when you're talking about voice, Katie, when I think about your stories, I think about place. And sometimes I think place is even stronger than the high concept. And so I know you studied geography and all that. So could you talk a little bit about your feelings of place?
So the question is about how Katie feels about place and landscape in her short story.
Yeah, I something I was talking about with my students last week is the relationship that characters have with place. They're usually either in harmony with their place or they're in conflict with it. And I think that's always super interesting from the get-go, right? Everybody has places where they feel safe and places where they don't, right? And I'm interested in that sort of invisible boundaries that we walk through all the time and how they make us feel. And to me, place is very dynamic. We're seeing rapid change in our world all of the time right now, but it's always been ever changing, right? And early fiction, early novels, they didn't have much of a sense of place typically. You could even swap them really between cities and it would be okay. It wouldn't really change the story. But I see our relationship as people to place as being far more profound than that. You can't just swap out, oh, I'm going to switch the city, now it's over here. The rules are different, the place is different. So my characters are living in dynamic worlds with changing places that have shaping effects on them, right? And having lived in a number of different places, I've been in Northern California now for over 20 years, the longest I've lived anywhere. And so California especially is really profoundly important to me in my writing, and I like to sort of write love letters to it, but I also am not afraid to call it out when it's doing something wrong. You know?
Other stories, there's some rows in the back there, I think, that have some questions. Questions? Ben?
Yeah, you talked about ambiguity being a kind of like a hallmark for short stories. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you approached, as a writer, how you approached ambiguity.
So if ambiguity is a hallmark of short stories, how does Katie work with that?
Yeah, so I feel, when I think about ambiguity, I usually think about endings, right? And how we end pieces. Is it an ambiguous ending? Is it an ending that, makes you feel resolved and, sure of where it's going for the character after the story ends? And personally, I really love an ambiguous ending in a short story because it feels more like life to me. And I also think we as readers think more about ambiguous endings than we do resolved endings. They leave us with more to chew on afterwards. If the problems aren't entirely resolved, the characters are all safe and everything's good again. And it just feels like this sort of mirror on life, which I think when you're writing fiction, authenticity is really important. You want to create a believable and authentic world with believable and authentic characters experiencing things that are believable and authentic. And so having an ambiguous ending is part of that.
We have time for one more question. Oh, sure.
That's a really interesting point. Would you consider ever concluding a novel with an ambiguous ending, or is that only true for short stories?
Yeah, actually, I think my first novel has an ambiguous ending. So yeah, I would. I don't mind novels that have ambiguous endings, though my readers are always like, I don't know if that's going to be okay. Like your early readers before it goes to print, that's usually something that gets called out to me, and I have to decide whether I want to fight for the ending I have written or whether I want to listen.
Is there one last question way in the back there? Yeah.
Hi. I wonder about, Buzbee talked to our class and he always tells that, like, you as a writer, 90% of the time, living as a writer, you revise and you edit. So I do wonder about how much of your original first draft made it to the final published book, and what were your process in revising and editing and, thinking through, this story, ditching it, or I'm gonna include this story, or like the tweaking of the stories that you actually put in the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm a merciless editor. I have no problem just like, I don't like it anymore, I'm cutting that story. It's dead to me. But I would say what's interesting to me, sometimes I'll go back and look at that first draft. And what's interesting to me is the voice is there. The bones of it are there, you know, from the beginning. That's the cool thing about it. You might do a ton of work to change the plot and where the story goes, but that origin point, whatever was inspiring to me, the voice that I found, the setup, it's all still strong, as you know, it's very strong in the first draft. And that, seeing that happen over and over the years has been really helpful to me, right? To know that I can trust myself as a writer from the very beginning. That voice and that concept that I'm in love with is I got to keep working with it and not ditch it, right? But that's not to say that I don't revise like crazy. I think my revisions are oftentimes more about sort of meticulous pacing is everything to me. I'm really into pacing, plotting, which relates to pacing. Those things don't come out perfect the first time, right? And so that's where the direction I tend to go in revision. Interestingly, with the last novel that I wrote, I tried a totally different process than I've ever used before. Typically, I'm like an overwriter. I just start going to town. I write whatever comes to mind. I'll cut it up later. This time around, what I did is I spent months thinking about it before I even wrote anything down. Nothing. Just thought about it. And then before I wrote any words, I wrote a pitch for myself. You know, just a paragraph. Basically the description of the book that I explained to you. I wrote that pitch. I was like, okay. Now I know, kind of generally speaking, what I'm doing. And then when I sat down to write it, I was just ready. I thought about it for so long. I kind of knew where I was going. I wasn't doing a lot of figuring it out on the fly. I mean, surprises still came in the draft. But with that particular project, I wrote the first draft in a week because I was just locked in and I knew what I was doing. I knew where I was going, and and haven't revised it a ton. I feel like it came out. I'm going to do a ton of revising. Don't get me wrong. I haven't gotten feedback yet, but I feel really happy with it. So I don't know, this process, this new, I might have unlocked something new for myself. I don't know. Find out.
Katie never sleeps, so that's. Listen, I'm a former bookseller, and I just got to be a bookseller now. You have to read this book. It's an amazing look at how we live today and all of the questions that surround it. So thanks, Katie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Let's give another round of applause for Lewis Buzbee. And then another one for Flynn and so please go buy their books up front. The 2 registers have copies, and then Katie will be signing them at that back desk where there's a sign. And when you line up, because there are so many of you, which is so awesome, please try to go down as best you can that back aisle. And have a great night. Thank you so much for coming here. And buy some books. All right, you're free.